further ado, I'd like to present Dr. DellaSala. Turn the lights down.
Thanks, Mike. I hate podiums, so I'm just going to move away from that. You guys with the cameras, let me know if I'm moving off of your field of vision. Well, good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing? All right. I've got two really important questions to ask. And before we turn the lights off, I want to make sure everybody gets their exercise, okay? So stand up if you love the Banner Forest. And if you can't stand, just raise your hand, okay? Gotcha, 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 gotcha. Okay, please sit down. Gotcha one more time. Stand up if you are a Seattle Seahawks fan rooting for the team. Uh-oh, we got some LA fans in here. Uh-oh. Well, fear not. I am a New York Jets fan. Yeah. The last time they won the Super Bowl, man was on the moon. Think about that, right? So I'm a suffering Jets fan. I grew up in New York and in Brooklyn, so forget about it. And I've been working in some of the most biodiverse forests on the planet since my early 20s. And so I'm kind of in the sunset of my career. I parachute into these incredible places, these forests, and I learn about them as much as I can. And then we work with communities to see about what the conservation needs are. And I started my career doing what we call bio-blitzes. They would literally take teams of scientists like myself, put us into certain areas and say, okay, there's your transect, walk that line and count as many species as you can, as fast as you can, to inventory the biodiversity in these places because they're going away so fast. And so yesterday, I had the pleasure of being on the ground in your park. I spent the entire day walking most of the trails, doing kind of this mental inventory of what I was seeing out there that I hope will help inform you today in terms of what some options might be. And because I had you guys get up twice, I promise this is going to be about the Banner Forest, and there's going to be some Seahawks stuff in here too, not to disappoint. So anyway, I am an expert in forest ecosystems globally. I've worked many, many years in the Pacific Northwest, but yesterday was my first experience in Banner Heritage Forest Park. And so I was brought in to just assess the situation. I did talk to the county before I arrived here. They were kind enough to give me their time. We did a Zoom call, so I got their perspective. I got the perspective from the friends groups that shepherded me around yesterday. We had a drone with us as well, so we got some drone footage. And we just did some basic ecology and basic walking around Banner Forest. So I got a really good thumbnail perspective of something that you guys already know, because you live and you love this special place. So I'll share with you my perspective as a forest ecologist looking in this very short period of time that I had, and also reading the documents, kind of speed reading the documents, because it was like a fire hose of information in a very short period of time, so I can interpret what some of the alternatives or options may be that you all want and the county wants. So that's really kind of the focus of my talk today. And I want to thank everybody again for turning out in such great numbers. And now's the time to turn the lights down and get the slides going. You guys already had your exercise, so no sleeping while this is going on, okay? Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Okay, so one of the areas of my research is to distinguish between what is restoration and what is forest degradation. We use the word restoration a lot, but you really got to define and understand what you mean in contrast to an area that has been degraded. So a good chunk of my presentation today is going to focus on giving you all the tools to know what the difference is so that you can be more effectively communicating what you want with the county and vice versa. I hope to have a conversation with the county. We already talked about doing that after my visit to also get their perspective in the context of what you're going to see today. And Carrie is my lovely slide advancer. So thank you, Carrie, for going forward with the next slide. Okay, so I've spent almost a half a century of my life working in forest ecosystems around the globe. And it really comes down to in a nutshell, why forests are so important on the globe. And this applies to you guys too. Over 50% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, plants, wildlife, are found in forests. It's a lot of biodiversity to be inventorying, which is what my teams and I have been doing over that almost half century. In addition, forests have this kind of basket of ecosystem benefits that we get. They give us air filtration as the lungs of the planet. They give us and purify our water as cooling towers. They are involved in climate regulation as climate sanctuaries. Think about taking a walk in Banner Forest on a hot July day, and you step out of your cars in a very hot area, and you go into that forest. It's like being in outdoor air conditioning. The trees are giving you that cooling effect that we get from having an intact forest canopy. When you remove that canopy, now you got all that sunlight, you got that heat, you got that drying hitting the ground, and you lose that buffering capacity. So really important for climate regulation. There have been indigenous connections in these forests for millennia, and those are quite important to a lot of the tribal relations with these forests. There's the spiritual connection that many people have when they go into a forest and they feel different about things. It's a good way to decompress from the surroundings. There's the recreational, the biking that I saw, the horseback riding, the hiking, the dogs, and people walking. It was just a lovely day, and that's where you go. It's recreation, right? Medicinal plants, mushrooms, lots of other benefiting plants that are derived from forest, and there's also timber values. So that's the basket of ecosystem benefits that we get out of these forests. The more intact the forest is, the more the benefits are. So if a forest is degraded, it has fewer benefits. Next slide. Unfortunately, we have lost about half of the world's forest in my lifetime, mostly in my lifetime. And that chart you see there is a rolling average of tropical forest loss over a 2-decade period. It's been ongoing despite global efforts to slow it down. And I can give you the number there. It's 22,000 acres every hour of every day is lost in the world's tropics, or we can convert that over to soccer fields. I was just watching a soccer game outside over there. The equivalent of over 7,000 soccer fields of deforestation in the tropics every hour of every day. It's a lot of forest loss. Now, in the United States, my team has inventoried about 10% of our forests are considered mature and old growth. The rest have had a heavy managed influence. So that's not a lot, but it's still incredibly important in the US. Next slide. So there are a number of international fora that I've been involved in to try to slow global forest loss. And one of them is called the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that framework has a goal of protecting 30% of the world's forests by 2030. It's called 30 by 30. Only 14% is currently protected, so it's about a doubling within, 4 years left? But that goal was set up in 2015. There's also a restoration goal of restoring about 864 million acres by 2030. And then there was a New York Declaration that was signed by 162 countries in 2015 to end deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. Those are really great, lofty, important goals. And it's happening on a global scale, and it's a place where all communities can plug in through contributions at the local level. So what might the contribution be for the Banner heritage forest in the context of those global goals? And we could take a look at that as we get through the rest of the presentation. But it's just keep in mind, you guys are operating locally, but this is happening all over the world. Every place that I go gives me strength, gives me hope for a sustainable future because of what I see at the local level, and then I can carry it forward to the global level. Next slide. So I like to start presentations with definitions so we know what we're all talking about. It's really important to understand terms because it's the way language is the way we communicate, and to have effective communication, we need to be talking the same language. So let's start with what do we mean by deforestation? The slide there is tropical deforestation. You can see the difference on one side of the road versus the other. It's a permanent change in forest cover. You convert it over to agriculture, you grow cows on it, or you put pavement on there. That's deforestation. It's most prevalent in the tropics because the forests, once they're cut down like this, they don't come back. Next slide. Then there is forest degradation, because remember we had that global goal, halt deforestation and degradation by 2030. What is degradation? So degradation in most scientific studies is the reduction of ecological integrity as compared to a reference site. What is ecological integrity? Something that has integrity has all the parts present, right? That's acting in integrity. You're acting with all your parts present. In a forest, the integrity can be measured on the ground by the number of native species that should be there, whether the forest is working the way it should be working, it's functioning properly, and whether all the processes are in place, whether it's wildfires in the dry forest, whether it's tree fall gaps in the wet forest. Those processes are cycling nutrients, they're all working together. That's a forest of high integrity. So you could start with a forest of high integrity on your reference site, and you see on the right of that, and then you can look at that in context of different management treatments in terms of how far removed you are from the reference site as to whether or not you're doing restoration or degradation. That's how we measure these things. And we can take it out in the ground with a checklist with all these variables that we look at: soil compaction, invasive species, wildlife, and just kind of go through a checklist. Reference condition, areas that we've treated, is that degradation or restoration? So we can do this. There are metrics for doing this on the ground. Next slide. One of the biggest impacts on landscapes is roads. And in the US, on national forests, there are over 380,000 miles of roads, which is enough to drive around the circumference of the planet 16 times. And that's one of the biggest degradation factors on forests, at least in our forest systems. And it also brings with it the possibility of unwanted fire ignitions. So roads are a bad thing on the landscape. They're great for getting around, they're great for access, but you have to scratch your head, do we really need that many roads? So it's just one thing to consider in terms of measuring degradation. Roads are part of that metric. Next slide. Okay, so you guys are right there, that little green spot right in the center left, the Banner Forest. Now watch this little trick we're going to pull here. Carrie's going to help me with. Global Forest Watch has been tracking forest degradation on a global scale. And give Carrie a second or two here to pull up a different screen. I want to show you what's been happening on the peninsula over the last 2 decades. So the blue that you see, those blue dots, those are forests that are growing back. The red that you see there, those are forests that have been clear cut. So we're going to take you back in time to 2021, is it? But yeah, and we're going to advance this 2 decades. Watch the color change on the screen. Okay, so we just went ahead 2 decades. Carrie, can you point on the screen where you guys are located, please? Okay, can everybody see that little hand? Just kind of swirl it around. There you go. That's where you guys are. Can you click it again from the beginning? Now pay attention to that spot, because this is your backyard. Watch it change over 2 decades. Look at what happened to the peninsula. Look at Northern Oregon. I can see why you guys love your forest, because so much of the surroundings have been changing. Thanks, Carrie. Give her a second to flip back onto the other part of the screen. So a lot of degradation that's been happening in the surroundings. Okay, so that's kind of a snapshot. You guys are in an oasis, in a sea of development. So I definitely can see why you love your forest, because this is the sanctuary for people, for wildlife, and all the things that we value in the surroundings that have been intensively developed and are going to continue to be developed as more and more people move here. Next slide. Okay, so I had some time to read through the county's forest planning documents. I spent a little bit of time, and I'm going to extract language from those documents so we know what we're talking about, and we can kind of tease it apart to see how that's playing out on the ground. So some really good statements in these documents. The Banner Forest Management Plan is set up for a vision that's focused on education, habitat, public use, and recreational activity. Those are really good guiding mechanisms for developing a forest management plan. But the forestry that's being proposed needs to be consistent with those overall goals, which have been set forth for the forest that you love. Next slide. Let's tease it apart a little bit more. I started to think about this notion of a heritage park. What does that mean? And I kept scanning the documents and scanning them, and I couldn't find a definition of what is heritage. But I found some in the dictionary, something that's handed down from the past, as in tradition, a legacy, something that has been inherited is a heritage. The 7 generations concept of Native American people. This was mentioned by the county, the government as well in my phone call. They're thinking 7 generations. Large trees, old trees are heritage elements. But what really does it mean? It's something that I struggled with because I couldn't find really clear definitions in the documents. So it's something to think about, because I'll wrap up on that later on. But I'm just flagging it now as a missing component. Next, please. And then I started to look at the plans, and I started to pull information out with my discussion with the Kitsap County folks. They mentioned that 13 of the 75 parks are focal areas with about 9,500 acres of forest. In the banner forest, they were proposing that amount of thinning that you see up there. We'll talk about that. And they talk a lot about desired future conditions, where they want to move the forest from where it is now to where they would like it to go over time. And to do that, they're talking about treatments that would remove, in places, up to half of the trees, leaving 8 large, 8 medium, and 2 large snags per acre. So those were that's some of the information I was able to extract from the documents, taking no trees greater than 24 inches DBH, diameter breast height. But when I was doing my walk through the field yesterday, I didn't see a lot of trees above 24 inches diameter. So that's a pretty upper bound limit on thinning. Because when you don't have a lot of trees that big to begin with, does it really mean much to have a cap set that high up on what you can't take in thinning? The road system, it was hard to get from the forest plan how much they're going to open. We've already talked about how roads are degrading and not restoration. And the good part of it is they're focused on these desired future conditions to increase structural complexity. That's good. That's a good thing. How you do it, though, is a matter of perspective that we'll talk about. Next slide. Then I look for language, because again, we keep coming back to language. What do they mean? What's the definition? They use in their documents in several areas health, forest health, healthy ecosystems, healthy communities. What does that mean, right? And we're going to talk about that as well. And then they get into this thing about prescriptions. It's like you went to a doctor and you got prescribed because you were feeling sick. The forest is unhealthy. We have to prescribe a treatment. It's a very kind of medical focused language, depending on your interpretation of what health is. Is it unhealthy? Is it sick? Or is it just being what it's supposed to be? Next. Their restoration, it's got some good statements in there. I like some of this. They talk about departure from desired conditions. And they talk about guided by historical conditions and, kind of mixing in the past and future climate. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But again, what does it mean to be departed from desired conditions if you don't have a reference site? I don't see any information on reference sites. I do see a notion of backcasting to an historical time period, but I still don't see a reference. What's the reference area that has high integrity, that you're trying to restore something that has been degraded to a higher integrity state? That's missing. Next. More language in there that's got some good elements to it. You can question, what does resilience mean? We're doing stewardship and restoration to achieve resilience, but what is that, right? What is that in practice? I know what it is ecologically, but what does it mean in practice? High quality habitats, yeah, good one. Refugia, and as forests get older, they become more of a refuge, a sanctuary for all those values, those basket of ecosystem benefits that I laid out earlier. The older the trees are, the older the forests are, the more they accrue those benefits. That's refugia, especially in a changing climate when everything else is warming up and drying in the surroundings. Next. This is a big one. I get this a lot. In fact, I've been testifying in front of congressional committees now for over 30 years about this term, forest health. What the heck does it mean? How do you know if a forest is sick or healthy? They list that they've got a bunch of small trees in the parks. They don't have enough large trees. Yeah, okay. But is that unhealthy? They also talk about the need to boost tree vigor and tree growth. That sounds like a very forestry kind of minded approach, and we can talk a little bit about that. But a lot of this is based on health, okay? And those two slides that you see on the upper and the lower right, my right, this side, the top one looked pretty darn healthy to me on most of the field walks that I was doing yesterday. The bottom one, those young stands, okay, there's something going on in there. We can talk about that. And I'm going to pick this apart as we go through the slides. Next one, please. This is all county language, by the way. So in my walk yesterday, I went from the south to the north gate. You guys know where all these places are. I've listed them all. And it was my 6-hour tour through the park and trying to gather as much information like one of those early bio blitzes 40 years ago. I was just soaking it all up on a beautiful winter day in your park. I didn't see much evidence of an unhealthy forest. I saw a forest that was doing what it's supposed to be doing. Yeah. I saw some examples of really cool stuff, like that tree on my left now, looking this way. You see some pitch there. It's kind of like a bluish gray. And, you know, it's probably a beetle in there causing the tree to defend itself. That's how these trees defend themselves. They pitch. And so when the beetle lands on that, it's like flypaper. It's not getting off of that sap. So that's a healthy response to an insect that's trying to get in there, and the tree is responding the way nature designed it. I didn't see that much of this going on. Now, if you get to a point where a lot of trees are doing this, you could say, yeah, okay, you might be in the beginning phase of an outbreak. I didn't see that. All the places that I walked around yesterday. I did see a little bit of canopy kill. You can see it on this side. Those upper trees with the white tops look to me like they may have had some pine beetle in them, but it was really localized. There weren't a lot of places where I was able to see that, and I was looking intently for this all throughout my trip yesterday. So these kind of mid-cereal, these mid-age forests, they look like what they're supposed to look like. There was no health crisis that I was able to see in those mid-forest stages. So really, the whole healthy forest thing to me was meaningless because I didn't see it. Next one. Okay, I encounter this problem all the time. How can there be more than one truth? In the case of the Banner Forest, the perspectives of how you look at the forest really determine what your truth is. So you can have one truth that says, hey, the forest is overstocked, it needs restoration, including some commercial removals, or you can have the flip side of that. It looks pretty healthy to me. I don't think it needs any major intervention, and now we have dueling perspectives. Looking at the exact same piece of land with this difference in perspectives. It's happened every single time I've been on walks through the forest with foresters and wildlife people and decision makers, all looking at the same thing. Imagine putting on a pair of sunglasses and looking at the same scene, and half the people see it in blue and half the people see it in red, but the same object. They're looking at the same object, but they're seeing it in different colors. That's what's going on. It depends on what your value system is, how you see the forest, and therefore how you react to whether it's a problem of unhealthy or whether it's beautiful and just doing its own thing. And if it's unhealthy, it needs active management. And if it's doing its own thing, nature knows what it's doing, right? And no one trusts anyone. That's where you guys are. You're right smack in the middle of that with the county parks. How do we break loose of that? And we'll talk about that later. Next. Okay, so I'm going to return to this. It was a publication that I did with about 12 other people around the world working on forest ecosystems pretty much all over the planet. We wanted to figure out, how do we know if it's restoration or degradation? I'm going to return to a reference site, an area that is working the way nature designed it. Native species, everything functioning right, the structures in place, high integrity. Then you move that system to a different state through management. Is it restoration or degradation? And it's a gradient. On that little bar you see, that multicolored bar, high integrity is green, low integrity is red. And you can approach tipping points where you have degraded the system so much it functions like it's been deforested. Where you remove so many trees, like you see that slide on my right again, that it really is not functioning as a forest anymore. That's extreme degradation. Again, we know how to measure this. We can take a checklist out in the forest and we can start checking off boxes. Native species present, intact forest canopy, and so on. And we can give it a scoring and then compare that to an area that has been managed to determine, is it restoration or degradation? And I saw a lot of that yesterday. Next. So you have to have a reference site. So when I was growing up as an undergrad, I took some of my first forest ecology classes, and we learned that forests go through changes over time. It's called forest succession. And we were taught that it's a linear process, going from pioneer stage to old growth. That's where you see that horizontal arrow over there. I have now been writing articles with colleagues. It's not linear. It's circular. And it's all connected in the forest. So you can have an old growth forest that is at the later stage of succession with a tree fall gap. Inside that gap are pioneer organisms, all racing to come up to the light, the early stage of forest development at the level of a tree fall gap inside an old growth forest. So old growth connected to young growth inside the same stand is circular succession. And it changes your perspective if you're trying to push the system forward and forward and forward in time, when in fact it just wants to be circular. Then it's going to have natural disturbances inside old forest. And it's going to continue to go around this circle. This is going to go on and on and on, regardless of our intervention. So we have to rewrite the textbooks that these successional changes are circular and they're all connected. Next. Okay, so here's my ChatGPT assisted graphic. So that chart you see on this side has time on the y-axis and successional stage on the x-axis. So I'm going to relate this to what I saw yesterday. So if you are on that left side, early successional, which is where that vertical arrow is on a lot of the stands that I saw yesterday, you might want to do some assisted restoration. If you are kind of in that mid-successional, leaning towards late successional, just let it go. It's already on its trajectory. It just needs a little bit more time to get to the structural development of a late successional forest. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. So you could have both perspectives working together in the park, where there are places that nature knows best. These mid-successional forests, they just need some loving and monitoring. You don't need to do anything in them, pretty much. And then you have these other places that look like that, dog hair, that might need some assisted restoration. So both truths existing in the same sphere of reality if we were to work together. Next slide. Oops, can you go backwards a minute? forgot one other thing. If you look at those two vertical lines on the right, the distance in time to go from one to the other is only a couple of decades. Your forests are only a couple of decades away from having late successional characteristics, high integrity. Just let them go. It's not worth the amount of investments in restoration and pulling trees out and degradation costs to just get them another 2 or 3 decades up that curve. But if you look all the way to the left on the early successional, it's going to take maybe 60 to 80 years to get them up that curve. That's what they might need some help with. Okay, next one. Thanks. All right, so your mid-cereal forests are healthy forests. Everywhere I went yesterday looked healthy to me, and I specialize in this. Thanks. I was straining my eyes to find any place that, looked like it had a lot of tree kill. And in fact, what I wanted to see was more tree kill. That creates structure, snags, logs on the ground. So there's room for more tree kill, not less. Next. I want to focus a little bit on natural disturbance ecology because that really determines whether a site has high integrity or not. Is it working the way nature designed? And the way nature designs your forest is your main disturbance dynamics are tree fall gaps. Inside a stand, a tree is going to die, a big mother tree eventually is going to die. That opens up the canopy for light penetrance and to start that whole circular succession of pioneering organisms racing to the top, including the progeny of the tree that died. That's the majority of tree fall gap disturbances you get in coastal rainforests. You're in a coastal rainforest. Now, tree death is a natural process that in old-growth forests will average 1% to 2% of the large trees will die every year as new large trees are coming into the canopy. That's natural. That's not unhealthy. Now, you also have landscape level disturbances. You'll get an occasional rare fire that will come through. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you'll get windstorms that'll knock down large numbers of trees. That's your disturbance ecology. Your natural forests are supposed to be dense. It's a rainforest. We're not talking about frequent fire, dry forests that have a lot of spacing between trees. We're talking about a rainforest with a lot of biomass in it. That's natural. So let's focus a little bit on fires. They do occur occasionally on the peninsula, but with very large intervals between major fire events, anywhere from about a century to more, depending on how wet the forest is. The forest fires tend to be large, rare, and infrequent, and they're triggered by climate and lightning. So they're climate-limited fires. You'll get them on occasion when you've had successive drought, but again, you're in a rainforest. And so when you do get unusually hot, dry periods and east-flowing winds, you have conditions for fires, but it's very infrequent. It is changing from climate change, and we can talk a little bit about that too. But, you're not in a system like this, you don't really want to thin for fire concerns because it's not the way the forests were designed. They're not going to burn frequently. They're not going to be naturally open. They're dense coastal rainforest. Next. So nature has a fire insurance policy. Nature's fire insurance policy is many, and it mostly happens as trees get bigger and older. You might recall when you're walking around the forest, those large trees have dropped all their lower branches. It's hard for fire to get in the crowns when there aren't any lower branches. They've also thickened up their bark, and it's kind of a natural protection against most fires. And And in fact, the old forests tend to burn in low fire severities in the Pacific Northwest. That's been shown by many studies. So nature is building up fire resistance through aging its forests over time. Thick bark, moist microclimates, and the buffering against wind. The more trees you have in the forest stand, the more it acts as a buffer so you don't get winds pushing through the understory and then, fanning the flames so they get into the tree crown. So we want our forests to get older because that's fire insurance by nature. Next one. That guy on the left there, that's Richard Nixon. And he's hosing his house in a fire. You also notice that he has a wood shingle roof. Bad Nixon, bad Nixon. This is the best human fire insurance policy. Work on home hardening, work from the home out. There's numerous studies, including experimental evidence. The number one way for communities to survive forest fires is home hardening, defensible space, doing what you see on this slide. And I could speak from experience on this because I lost half of my town where I live in Southern Oregon in the Labor Day fire of 2020, which was a climate-driven fire event with a community that was spending millions of dollars logging in the backcountry, thinking that was fire prevention, when in fact what happened was almost 3,000 structures burned down in a single night because of ember cast. The embers were blowing sideways in 40-mile-an-hour winds, going from house to house like in a domino effect. And within a single night, I lost half of my town because the community was unprepared. It wasn't doing home hardening defensible space. It was relying on the Forest Service to thin in the backcountry, which did nothing to protect communities. So it really comes down to the home itself. Next slide. I want to return to this. When is thinning, which is used a lot as a restoration tool, restoration versus degradation. This is a paper that we have in the final stages of peer review. Again, it's another international paper. We kind of put it on this two-dimensional axis, but there's really more dimensions to this, and I'll talk about that. But it is a function of the intensity of the thinning, the type of trees that are removed, and the scale of the operation, with the impacts increasing from left to right. So if you're thinning from below, you're taking small trees, you're doing prescribed burning, you're not going to have as much of a degradation effect, and you can actually have restoration outcomes. If you start plucking off large trees and you rely on your road system, or you build roads and you turn, roads that are going back into the land and foresting into roads again, and you put out skid trails, you're increasing impacts left to right again, right? You see those arrows getting taller. You want to be way on the left side if you're doing restoration. You don't want to be on that right side of the figure. And again, we can measure this in the field. Next slide. All right, I promised you guys a Seahawks slide. You're getting it now. So I started to think, actually I really wasn't thinking, ChatGPT did it for me. How am I going to show this? Okay, so the county's talking about their prescriptions. Let's put the trees on the Seahawk field as if they were growing there. On this side is a coastal rainforest that's naturally dense, packed into the Seahawk Stadium. 300 trees per acre, because a football field, minus the goalpost, is about an acre in size. Now, let's apply the county proposed prescriptions to that football field. This side, let's take out half the trees. Look at the difference. The problem with this, you are in a coastal rainforest, naturally dense, you're applying dry site thinning prescriptions. It doesn't make sense. because the forest is supposed to be naturally dense in those semi-natural, mid-successional forests that we talked about. You would not be doing restoration in those areas, yet that's the prescription that's being proposed. Next slide. And we saw this in the field. Now, this is not Banner, but this is Wicks County Park, where the thinning was so extreme, and that's a drone slide there. It really, we tried to get above the canopy to give you kind of a sense of how much thinning was going on, but you really got to go out there and take a look at it for yourself because it was shocking. It looked like that football field example, and that's going to elevate your impacts. Remember that two-dimensional slide that I showed you? Impacts go up. When you take out too many overstory trees, you overventilate the forest, meaning you have too much wind coming in, which is going to fan your fires, dry out your soils, and make the system more prone to fire. Then you've got soil damage, you've got invasive species, you've got fine fuels that are on the ground, you can't treat them all. You've dried out that nice wet microclimate, and you lost the wind buffer. So you actually can make these forests more prone to fire by taking out too many of the overstory trees. And this is one of their prescriptions, at least in Wicks County. Next. Okay, this one was a shocker. I have never seen Scotch broom grown like this before. And this was one of the sites we visited that you could see on this side when the park was first acquired. Then they went and did a thinning operation. This is pretty close, but not exactly the same location. And that was the response. So look how tall that Scotch broom is. They did a great job growing Scotch broom, but not in restoring the forest. In fact, this is extreme degradation. And it really is shocking how much, and I don't know how you deal with that. It was everywhere where we were walking yesterday. Next slide. Okay, so I'm getting close to wrapping up, and then we're going to take questions. I wanted to have a lot of time for questions, but this is where I think the two perspectives can come together. Just stay out of the semi-natural areas, those mid-successional stands, and let's talk about what to do with the young log stands that look like this, because there are about 93 acres of this on the Banner. What if you did nothing? Just let them be, right? That's one outcome. It'll take about 60, 80 years before those stands self-thin and start to open up, develop structure, have snags, have large trees on the ground, have plant diversity in the understory, lack Scotch broom. If you just let them be, right? That's one option. The other option is let's speed it up. Let's leapfrog and reduce the time interval on that little graph that I showed you of increasing structural complexity. And we could do that by thinning out some of the competing stems, and that would increase the growth rate of the remaining trees. This is a forestry approach that's been used throughout the Pacific Northwest. That's an option too. You could set a limit on it. The county had less than, they wouldn't take any trees that were greater than 24 inches diameter breast height, but I didn't see a lot of trees out there that were greater than 24 inches. Maybe that diameter needs to be set at 9 inches, because that really corresponds to what I was seeing yesterday in these densely grown stands. So you could set your diameter limits much lower than what they were talking about. This is more of a surgical operation than a broadcast operation. Start slow, do some monitoring, see what the responses are, have controls, have treatment areas, and no heavy equipment. There's no need for heavy machinery if you're going after trees that are 9 inches or less in diameter. You can do a lot of hand sawing, a lot of chainsaws at the local level without heavy machinery, which would cause all kinds of soil compaction problems. There's no commercial value in those trees, so you're going to have to get creative about how you fund it, and you can use the existing trails with no road upgrades. So that might be one alternative. It's just what I noticed, what I was kind of trying to cue in on. Yeah, those young stands, they look pretty bad, and they're all Doug fir. And the site index in those areas would indicate you can have more than Doug fir in those areas. You could have cedar mixing in with the Doug fir. You could have spruce, hemlock, and I wasn't seeing that. So that might be an area for taking out, lowering those Doug fir densities and planting, assisted planting with cedar, with hemlock, with the missing elements in those forests. So that's where assisted restoration could work. Next. Okay, so back to the Seahawks. How do you thin these forests? On this side, my right, looking at the screen, is the typical thinning grid pattern. They tend to grid thin on 8 to 10 feet spacing intervals between trees. On this side is sloppy thinning, where you thin in starts and stops, starts and stops. You create a sloppy thinning operation where you have clusters of trees that weren't thinned and areas that spaces where there was thinning. That might give you more heterogeneity, lower the impacts, and allow the stand to kind of have both dense areas and treated areas. And that might be an experimental design to see how things are responding than using the traditional kind of trees growing like corn that just is not restoration. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned earlier that we can assess thinning impacts by intensity of operation, types of trees removed, and scale of the operation, and context. And I didn't talk about context. So I'm going to talk about context now. And context really matters. So you see those purple areas on that slide, that diagram to the left, looking at the screen again. Those are areas that are proposed for thinning in your park. And they're juxtaposed with private areas, some of which have a lot of Scotch broom problems. And the places that have Scotch broom are the source material, the seed banks for Scotch broom to propagate. Scotch broom loves the sunlight. So the more you thin an area, the more you've created Scotch broom habitat. Juxtaposition context means if there is a Scotch broom outbreak outside the park along that boundary where you're thinning, you're going to have Scotch broom very quickly in those thin stands. Context matters. Keeping Scotch broom out of the park is a #1 priority. Next. Then what do you do with the fuels when you've done thinning? That's a tricky one because you don't want to raise your fire problems. So you could do lop and scatter. You can send it, you can kind of just masticate those. You know, you get a machine out there that's low impact. You don't want to do any damage to the soil, and get those ground up into fine materials like bark chips and scatter them back on the forest floor. That might be one way to deal with the residue so you don't raise your fuel problems. Next. Okay, what about these mid-cereal forests? I just think they need to be loved. You know, I was out there hugging a bunch of big trees yesterday. That's all they need. You know, really don't need to do anything else. And they just need a little time. They're on that trajectory to late cereal. They just need maybe 2 or 3 decades and they'll be there on their own, and it really is not worth the restoration cost in financing and the impact cost and what it would do to the soils with heavy logging machinery. It's not worth it to leapfrog a couple of decades when it's going to happen anyhow. There may be some situations where you could create some canopy gaps to create, kill some trees to give you some snags, which would open up the light to open up the canopy for light to hit the forest floor, then maybe you can plant with cedar, with white pine on the dry sites, with hemlock, to give you more of a mix, because it's mostly Doug fir out there. There's some cedar in the wetter areas, but you could reintroduce some of the native species that should be out there, and by killing some of the trees and creating snags, and then those snags will eventually become logs on the ground, which will be nurse logs that are needed in there as well. There's no need for roads. There's no need for heavy equipment. There's no need to go back in and clear these roads that are already revegetating or becoming trails. Just let that be. And here's the kicker, too. I think this is a place where everyone can work together. What the heck does heritage mean? The park is named a heritage park, but what does that mean? Why not do a heritage inventory? Get out there and just, okay, this is a large tree, that's heritage. This is a favorite mushroom picking place, that's heritage. This is a place where I see a lot of birds that are queuing in on diversity of forest, heritage. We need to kind of have a checklist and a definition of what heritage is and ways to manage that forest for its heritage foundation. Scotch broom is not a heritage, but it's heading in that direction, unfortunately, in some places. Next. I found all kinds of critters out there yesterday, including this white dove that greeted me, whatever that is. So anyway, kind of wrapping this up, I guess this is my closing slide. Trying to bring it all together here, that I have a very depressing job. I've been doing this for 45 years now, watching the world's forest shrink before my very eyes. But I also am optimistic because of what I see in communities like yours. And that's a good thing, because the more I see that happening, the more I think global and I see you acting local, it gives me hope. I think what we have here is a failure to communicate. And you guys both need a marriage counselor. The county and the community need to come together somehow, even though you may have different perspectives in terms of what the truth is. Working together is the best way to solve that. And the community can work with the county on an inventory of heritage elements that you guys want protected and they want restored, and see if you can come to terms with that. And I already said the mid-cereal stage of the forest, that's a heritage element. It's been there for, 50, 60 years. It's fine, it's heritage. Can you come to agreement on assisted restoration with no heavy equipment in those areas? Opening stands, probably not a good idea if you're near a Scotch broom seed bank. As we've seen in that one example, it's now a Scotch broom whatever. I won't call it a forest. More collaborative stewarding of the park and monitoring would be a way to work together. And then you got to figure out how to finance it, because true ecological restoration doesn't pencil out. And sprinkling in large trees to pay for it is just degradation. And I can kind of feel the push-pull that the county is experiencing, where they want to do something, but they don't have the funding to do it. But in some cases, doing nothing may be the best way to restore an area. And in other cases, it may be working with volunteers in creative ways to get the job done that might be able to get it done without having it to pencil out. I think that was my last slide. Maybe there's one more. And my hat's off to the county as well. I think from what I read, they've got some pretty noble vision statements in their documents. They're trying to do the right thing. From my discussions with them, I didn't detect an apparent commercial logging agenda, although they are taking some large trees that would have commercial value, and that's a red flag for me. There's a lot of great language in their forest plan. Both the county and the community loves the same area, but if you can put on the glasses and see the same color, maybe you have a chance to come together and work this out. Heritage elements are really the foundation here. Everything should be set in terms of goals around what those heritage elements are. And I struggled with trying to find it in the documents. Maybe it's there, and again, I only had a few days to kind of look at this, and maybe you guys know what it is. Stewardship group, I know it exists. It'd be a great idea to have it out there and have it elected leaders with equal representation across the groups, I think is the best way to go. I've seen that work effectively in other situations where you have equal weight in all the decisions, depending on what your interests are. I think a cost-benefit analysis needs to be done on whatever they're wanting to do, including no action in places like the mid-cereal forests, and alternatives like what we talked about in the young forest that don't involve heavy machinery. And how are you going to pay for that? Is it really worth leapfrogging in young stands that are 20 or 30 years old? I think it is, but you're not talking about removing any big trees. So how do you do that without the commercial logging aspect? And lastly, I want to thank both the county and the Friends of Banner Forest for bringing me out here today. The one positive I'm taking away is, again, I have a very depressing job at times, but when I come to communities like this and I see the outpouring of love of place, it makes me feel like, yeah, there is hope in the world. So you guys deserve the ovation for what you've been doing to love this place for so many years. And thanks again for bringing me out here.
Lights.
Lights.